Welcome to the MLA Citation Writing About Fiction PowerPoint for Ms. Montgomery's English 112. This PowerPoint is both a review and an introduction of some of the principles that may be new in this first unit of English 112. Since you have completed English 111 or the equivalent, you are expected to know and be responsible for MLA citation from the beginning of the course. But it's good to go over some basics and some unusual issues that come up in writing about literature more than they do in writing about other kinds of texts. First, a quick reminder that any direct quote of anyone else's specific phrasing, even very short ones, needs to be treated as a direct quote used in quotation marks, and of course with parenthetical citation in MLA. We will look at paraphrases and summaries later. Something that comes up in writing about literature more than it comes up in writing about other kinds of texts is dealing with titles. Titles of parts, a short story within a book, a song within an album, an article within the newspaper, and so on, are given quotation marks, as you see in some of the examples there. And then titles of wholes, the entire book, the entire movie, the entire play, the entire newspaper, and so forth, get underlined or italicized. And the reason for this convention, as you can see, if you look at the top bullet, The Things They Carried is a short story in a book of short stories, also called The Things They Carried. Hamlet is the title of the play, but then also the name of a character, and so on. So sometimes you'll be quoting from works of literature, and it will look pretty much like any other quotation that you have maybe already done in a research paper. And as we look at these next several slides, you'll see I have very technical explanations of how we just put together in the bullet points underneath the quote, and then I will give you some highlights in the recording. So here, again, I just have quotation marks, author page number in the reference, and that is all I need, because I'm just quoting some of Poe's words in description. Say I need to shorten a quote, particularly with imaginative literature. When you're writing a paper, you might want to deal with something that mentions another character that's irrelevant to your paper, or mentions another event in the story that is irrelevant to your paper. And you can do that with ellipsis points. They tell me that the words to the left are there, the words to the right are there, but then in the original text there are more words between them. And it is important to use ellipses only for length, not for obscuring meaning. For example, if someone says, "I do not agree," it's considered unethical to replace the "not" with ellipses and make someone look like they've said something other than what they have. Something unusual for working with literature that you may have run across, but you'll run across more in dealing with particularly prose fiction, is what do you do when there's dialogue? What do you do when there are already quotation marks in the material you are quoting? Wherever there are quotation marks, you put a layer of single quotation marks. So as you can see here, everything's essentially got 3 quotation marks around it because it is all dialogue. In this next quotation, you see within the quote, there are some places where dialogue leaves off and it's just the author's words, and then dialogue begins again. So you can see those 2 different layers of different kinds of quotation marks being used. Something else that comes up a lot in literature is the need to deal with multiple works by an author in the same paper. So when you are going to do that, and it's not entirely clear, say you're writing a paper that has very distinct sections about one work or another, it wouldn't be necessary to do that. But if it's in close proximity or it would be confusing, you just add a short form of the title in between your author's name and your page number. Block quotes are another way, of course, of handling quoted material. And a blocking essentially serves as that first layer of quotation marks. You notice here that I have not used any quotation marks because I don't need to. I've blocked the quote off and indicated that it is from the author. Notice I've also got a paragraph indent in addition to my blocking indent. You do try to make a block quote look as much like it looks in the text if there is anything unusual about it. You'll see this when we get to poetry, that you line up the poetry lines as similarly to how they're laid out as possible. And you will notice also that the parenthetical citation goes outside the period for a block quote, which is different from the rest of the parenthetical citations. And then if there is dialogue within your block quote, because you've already dealt with the first layer of quotation marks by creating a block quote, you can then just use standard quotation marks where there are quotation marks in the text from which you're quoting. So I've got James Joyce's words just blocked off there, and then you see I have standard quotation marks around the dialogue. So in addition to dealing with the textual details, sometimes you'll be making more general kinds of references to the events in the story. As I reminded you at the beginning of the presentation, there is no length of quote that is so short or so small that you don't have to use quotation marks. All direct quotes must be treated properly. But there are also ways of dealing with another's intellectual property without quoting directly. A paraphrase is going to be a restatement. Sometimes you may wish to take a very elaborate descriptive passage and boil it down to a specific event. Or you may wish to take a long series of events that goes on over a few paragraphs or even a few pages in a story and boil them down. So it's another's intellectual property, but it's being described in your own words. And then if you do very general summary, remember that we are not doing summary per se in these papers, but sometimes you'll want to make a broad statement about a theme or about a general arc in the action, and that would not receive a parenthetical citation because it would not be pinned down to one particular place in the text. And as always, err on the side of caution. So here's a one-sentence paraphrase. If you read Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, this description goes on for a few sentences, and I wouldn't necessarily need to take up that kind of space in my paper. So I just paraphrase it down into a sentence, no quotation marks, but the parenthetical reference tells my reader that that sentence is from someone else's material in terms of content, if not in terms of exact words. If you're going to do a multi-sentence paraphrase, which again comes up when dealing with narrative fiction for a series of events that you might want to abbreviate in some way, you frame. You start off with the author's name, and then you put the you put the page number at the end. And then for a general summary, you see this summary if you've read The Yellow Wallpaper. This is a very broad thematic statement about that particular story. It's the level of summary that you'd see on a book jacket or on a television listing. It does not point to a specific moment in the story. But then mentioning a specific event in the story does. And it's just as much a matter of accuracy and honesty as it is courtesy for your reader to be accurate in these matters. If you're asking someone to read your analysis, and you're making reference to a specific part of the text, you want to make it as easy as possible for your reader to find that text. So there is a link there to the Blue Ridge Community College library website, and then from that site there are many links to other sites, and then there are additional links provided in Blackboard, which I hope you've already had a chance, if not to visit the sites themselves, to at least familiarize yourself with where the links are in Blackboard. And then the Works Cited page, you'll notice this is single-spaced. It would be double-spaced on a standard word processor. But just a couple of highlights here. These are all works in an anthology. So you see I have my author's name, my title, the year of initial publication, the title of the anthology. Notice the entire title is there, as well as any edition number. And then notice all of these authors are cited as lead authors. They're not cited as anthology editors. And that's the same way that you want to treat Michael Meyer for our textbook, because he did in fact write the instructional chapters. So it is proper to treat him as the lead author. And then you have your city, your publisher, your year, your page range, and print, your medium of publication. Notice too, the first two entries in this works cited both reference Kate Chopin, so I've alphabetized the story titles themselves and then used the 3 dashes for the second reference to her. When we get to the novel unit of the course and you go and read an article about Stephen King, you might have an initial reference to King Stephen Carey, and then dash 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 Cujo, and then dash 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 Dreamcatcher, and then finally dash 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 The Shining, because there'd be several works by one writer. Also want to quickly change my screen here and show you something additional. This might look a bit strange for a moment. We are now in a Word document where I want to show you a couple of quick examples where I have cited from the same author or the same work. So if we look down at my works cited page, I cited 2 novels by Thomas Harris, and there I have Harris Thomas, and then there I have slash slash slash, and I've alphabetized the titles. You'll notice the MLA format is a bit different. This paper is 4 years old now, so it was a prior version when I wrote, but that part has remained the same for many editions, many years now. And up in the text, you see how this is handled. Notice I put 1 word from the title in the parenthetical reference. I abbreviate the title down to an initial elsewhere. Here I put the title in my sentence so it's clear. So it's just another addition to that part of the citation. And then here is another example where I had to cite 2 articles by the same critic. And you notice these had extremely similar titles. So when I did my abbreviation, it wouldn't have made any sense to start at the beginning. So what I did was choose the city names, because I figured those were the most distinctive words in the title, would make it easy for a reader. And if we go to look at the citations, here is the critic's name, and then here is one city. And then here is that same critic again, but the other city. And then when we get back down to the works cited entry, the titles make that distinction clear. So these are some details for you to consider. You, of course, will have the presentation to refer back to. You're not expected to memorize any of these at the extreme level of detail, but rather to be aware that there are some of these conventions for writing about literature, and make it part of your process to pay attention to how you are treating resources and make sure that you are complying with MLA documentation.